Daniel had known failure more intimately than he'd ever wanted. Writing had been his dream since he was a boy, ever since his grandmother had gifted him a worn copy of the Chronicles of Narnia. He devoured the book in a matter of days, enraptured by its rich world and unforgettable characters. He could still remember running his fingers over the soft, yellowing pages, daydreaming about the kinds of stories he'd one day write. But now, 35 years old and still unpublished, the dream had worn thin. Daniel had spent years writing and rewriting, pouring his soul into every story, only to be met with rejection after rejection. It wasn't for lack of trying either. His email inbox was filled with kind but firm refusals. "Thank you for submitting, but it's not quite right for us." His bookshelf was littered with self-help books on how to break into the writing industry, none of which seemed to hold the answers he was searching for. He had started with short stories. At first, he was naive, thinking his talent would speak for itself. He would write, submit to literary magazines, and wait for the inevitable acceptance letter that would validate all his hard work. But those letters never came. The rejection started small, trickling in like droplets of cold water, until they became a steady downpour. He had moved on to novels, thinking perhaps his stories just needed more room to breathe. He spent years crafting intricate plots, delving into the hearts and minds of his characters, convinced that this one would be the breakthrough. But after 6 novels and countless short stories, not a single one had been accepted. He started to feel like maybe the problem wasn't with the publishers. Maybe it was him. Maybe he just wasn't good enough. Daniel sat at his desk one evening, surrounded by stacks of paper, unfinished drafts, and rejection letters. His fingers hovered over the keyboard of his aging laptop, but no words came. The cursor blinked at him, mocking his inability to produce anything worth writing. He hadn't written a single word in days. The doubt that had been creeping into his mind for years was now an insidious force, wrapping itself around him like chains. He stared at the rejection letter he had received that morning, the same letter he had read 100 times, even though the words never changed. "We regret to inform you," the words stung every time. He rubbed his eyes, exhausted and frustrated. Maybe it was time to give up. He couldn't keep doing this to himself. He couldn't keep hoping that one day someone would see the value in his stories. Maybe his friends were right. Writing was a passion, sure, but it wasn't practical. It didn't pay the bills. Maybe it was time to settle down, get a real job, and let the dream die. His best friend, Matt, had given him that advice more than once. Matt was a corporate lawyer, living in a penthouse in the city, married with 2 kids, and another on the way. Every time they got together, Matt would smile and say, "Dan, I admire your persistence, but how long are you going to keep this up? You could do anything, you know. Why not put that talent to good use somewhere else?" Daniel would smile, nod, and brush it off. But the truth was, the thought haunted him. How long was he going to keep this up? How much more rejection could he take? He reached for the pile of unopened letters on his desk. Most of them were bills and a few more rejection slips he hadn't bothered to open yet. He sifted through them absent-mindedly, barely registering the names of the publishing houses. Another rejection, he thought as he picked up a letter from a small press he barely remembered submitting to. His heart clenched. He already knew what it said, so why bother reading it? It was just another door closed, another reminder that maybe this whole writing dream had been a waste of time. But something about this letter made him pause. It was heavier than the others, and instead of the usual white envelope, it was cream-colored with an embossed logo on the top left corner. His curiosity piqued, he tore it open. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, his breath caught in his throat. "Dear Mr. Daniel Harris, we are pleased to inform you that we would love to publish your manuscript." He read the sentence again, then again, just to make sure he hadn't imagined it. His heart began to pound. The words blurred on the page, and before he realized it, tears were welling up in his eyes. He read the rest of the letter, but the details barely registered. All he could focus on was that one word pleased. It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't a regretful decline. It was a yes. For a long moment, he just sat there staring at the letter in disbelief. His chest tightened as the emotions overwhelmed him: joy, relief, validation. After all the years of rejection, after all the times he had questioned himself, this one letter was enough to make it all worth it. He wiped his eyes and stood up, pacing the room as the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. He was going to be published. Someone had seen the value in his work. After all the times he had doubted himself, he had finally broken through. His phone buzzed, and he picked it up to see a text from Matt. "How's the writing going, man?" Any luck? Daniel stared at the text for a moment before typing a response. "Actually, yeah, big news, I'll call you tomorrow." He could already picture Matt's reaction, surprised, maybe a little smug. But Daniel didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt proud of himself. He had pushed through the doubt, the rejection, the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. And now he had something to show for it. The next morning, he called the publisher. The editor on the other end was friendly and enthusiastic, talking about marketing strategies and release dates. Daniel felt like he was in a dream. Was this really happening? He had spent so many years imagining this moment, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. Over the next few months, the whirlwind of editing, revisions, and meetings with the publisher consumed Daniel's life. He barely had time to process everything. But every time he held the finalized manuscript in his hands, he felt a sense of accomplishment that he had never known before. It wasn't just about the book. It was about him. He had proven to himself that he could do it, that he had the strength to keep going, even when everything seemed stacked against him. The day the book was finally published, Daniel stood in a small bookstore, surrounded by family, friends, and readers who had come to his launch event. He looked around the room, at the smiling faces and the copies of his book lined up on the shelves. It was everything he had dreamed of and more. When he stepped up to the podium to give his speech, he hesitated for a moment, looking down at the notes he had prepared. But then he put the notes aside. He didn't need them. "I've spent most of my life dreaming of this moment," he began, his voice shaky but strong. "But there were so many times I thought it would never happen. I almost gave up more times than I can count. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that perseverance is more important than talent. It's more important than luck. It's the thing that will keep you going when nothing else will." The room was silent, everyone listening intently. Daniel took a deep breath and continued. "There were countless rejection letters. So many people told me it wasn't going to happen, and I almost believed them. But I didn't give up. I kept writing, and now, standing here today, I realize that all those rejections, all those hard days, they were part of the journey. They were part of what made this moment so special." As he finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. Daniel looked out at the faces of his friends and family, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly successful. Not because of the book, but because he had never stopped believing in himself, even when it seemed impossible.